In this video tutorial we're gonna have a look at how you can center HTML elements with CSS. Before we start with that, I'm gonna give a little explanation about the float selector in CSS also. To do so, I created a small site with 2 images and 1 empty page, which are called index.html and which is opened in Dreamweaver here. I can start with inserting an image. Let's take the elephant. Then get some text. I always use the lorem ipsum dummy text and place it next to the image. Here we go. This is standard HTML behavior, what you see here, without applying any CSS. Now let's add some CSS. Dreamweaver can help me in generating a little bit of code. I go to the CSS panel, I say, well, define me some CSS in the page. Here you go, selectors or edits. And now I can start with my first class, float left, which I will give the selector float left. It's as easy as this. Now I go to my image, I select it, and I can apply the class float left to the image, and you see what happens to the text. It floats nicely next to the image. What most of the time is done is also add a margin at the float left class, so the text doesn't stick so close to the image. We can do that. Margin right, let's say 10 pixels. And here you go, excellent float of image with text. Of course, when you want the image to the right, you have to change your selector a little bit. I'm gonna keep the name of the class, float left, which is not so good if you're gonna let it float right, but we'll put it back afterwards. You change float left into float right, and then of course, not the margin right, but the margin left has to be 10 pixels. Look what happens. The image floats to the right and the text is nicely at the left of the image. Let's put it back to float left, like this. Okay. Let's now put a second image on our page. Let's say the gorilla. Let's also put some text next to it. We use the same text, copy paste, and we let the gorilla float left also. Since this is a tutorial, I should give an alt tag to my images. Don't forget that. I forgot it with the elephant, but we'll do that now. So like this. Now imagine that the text next to the elephant is a little bit shorter. Look what happens. That's not what we want. The gorilla is now floating next to the elephant. You could solve this by pressing some enters, but that is not good. Not a good solution. I'll tell you why. For that we have to preview our page in a browser. There you go. This is nice on this screen width, but if you go, for example, to a phone, you see the gorilla going down, the white space increases between the 2 images, and that is not good. Therefore, we have to use another solution. I'm gonna first remove the white spaces. So the other solution is by creating a class that is usually called clear float or stop float or something like that. And we just put in the selector clear both. Then typically you apply it to an empty div. I insert a div in Dreamweaver. I say with the class clear float. Here you go. Then Dreamweaver sets a standard text in that div, so we don't need that. I remove it. And now you can see that here I have an empty div with the class clear float, and that stops the floating next to the elephant. We're gonna look again in the browser. Looks good on this screen size and also looks perfect on smaller screen sizes up to a telephone. Let's go back to Dreamweaver and let's have a look at how we can center elements with CSS. I've added a few empty lines and I'm gonna insert the gorilla again. Here you go. Unfortunately, there's not a selector like float center. It does not exist. If you look it up on the internet how you have to center elements, you will find you have to do it with the selector margin left auto, margin right auto. I'll put that again in a class and we call the class center, for example. Margin left auto, margin right auto. Let's put that class on our gorilla. And unfortunately, nothing happens. To understand why, I have to tell you a little bit about inline HTML elements versus block elements. Now, the easiest way to tell that is to look that up on the internet. And I'm gonna search at the W3C pages because these are very good documentation pages. Here we go, and you get a good explanation. They start with telling block elements always start on a new line and take up the full width available. These are examples of block elements. Inline elements do not start on a new line and only take up as much width as necessary. And for example, an image is an inline element. This means that our image only takes space from here to here. Hence, it is centered in the space it takes. How can you center it on the whole page? Well, you have to tell the image to behave like a block element. You can do that in your CSS by adding the selector display block as a block element. Let's have a look now. And look, our gorilla is fine centered. Let's give another example and let's this time center a div block. So I'm going to insert a div, no class for the moment, and I'm going to put just the text in the div telling this, oh, I'm sorry. This is my div. Let's add the CSS another way with the style property in the code, style, and we learned to center you have to add margin left auto and margin right auto. Let's see what it does. It appears to do nothing, but I tell you this centers the div. But since the div is a block element and Dreamweaver shows it very nice with dotted lines, this block element is centered to the page. You can see that better if you say, let's make the div smaller. It's 250 pixels. You see, the div is really centered. Then of course the question remains, how do you center the text inside the div? Well, then you need another selector, CSS selector, the text align selector. I'm just gonna edit text align point center. And this centers the text inside the div. This centers the text inside this folder, being the div. We'll give one final example, and that is with a header. I'm just going to take the text title and I'm gonna give it a header h1. You see it here in the HTML. Again, I'll put the styles in a style tag, and I want to center the title with the margin left auto and the margin right auto. Nothing seems to happen. That's normal because we saw on the documentation this is a h1 is a block element. It takes the full width of the page, so this title is effectively centered because it takes the full width. We can show that better if we give him a background color. Let's try this one. There you go. You see the title has the full width, so it is centered. You can do the same as with the div. You can say this title is smaller by giving it a width. There you go. Now you see exactly that it's centered. I'm gonna remove that again. And if you want the text centered within the whole block element, you can use the text align just as in the previous example in the div. Text align, center. Here you go.